Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Christopher Paik. Hello, Christopher. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Lipton. Thank you.
Christopher, I'm such a big fan of your research. You are so smart. Christopher, tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Christopher Paik. I'm an associate professor of political science in the Division of Social Science at New York University, Abu Dhabi. And I'm also an affiliated faculty at the Family Politics Department at New York University.
All right, Christopher, and I read your brilliant piece titled Historical State Stability and Economic Development in Europe. Comment on it briefly, and then we're going to talk about why countries with a longer duration of state history today tend to be a bit poor.
Sure. So that paper was really motivated by this debate about whether state turnovers are good or bad for economy in the long run. A lot of the literature, the work suggests that this kind of debate critically depends on the type of historical events that you're looking at. But my co-author Harish and I were interested in the long-term aspect of it. So if you have multiple turnovers observed over the course of centuries, does that have any bearing on the kind of variation in contemporary economic outcomes that we see today? So we, as an effort to do this, we pull 20 centuries worth of state boundaries. We overlap multiple maps on top of each other, try to dissect at a very local gridded cell level the boundary changes that happen over 20 centuries, and then how that correlates to GDP per capita in that particular grid cell in 2020. Or 2000, I think it was 2010 actually, yeah.
All right then, and in your paper, you conclude that too much stability is likely indicative of elite capture and subsequent stagnation of innovation. Christopher, people often wonder, countries like Syria and Egypt, they have been around for a long time, but they are poor today relative to the West. Why is this so?
So this is definitely very much based on different contexts. So I'm not sure if I can answer that question based on that particular paper. Because if you think about it, the paper is focusing on regions in Europe. So it doesn't stretch to Syria, for example. But if we can generalize the findings from the paper, it would suggest that either places like Syria did not have enough turnovers, or it had too many turnovers. There's a sweet spot in the middle that we find empirically that makes it possible for a particular region to sustain very high level income today. But again, I think the implication may not extend far beyond the European context. I'm a bit cautious to make that comparison.
Okay, but I also read the paper you co-authored with Ola Olson. That's a broader paper. We discussed it already when he was on the show. And in your article, you also note that intermediate history is a better predictor of economic performance. Why?
Intermediate
state history, yes. And countries with a medium level of state history tend to do better.
So that's from a different paper, but I can imagine that if you have enough turnovers, what that would mean is that you benefit from what I would call creative destruction. So you need to allow states to reform and improve upon itself. But at the same time, you don't want to allow too many turnovers, because that would mean that there's no incentive for people to invest into the future, right? So in somewhere in between, at least empirically speaking, there's a sweet spot in the middle. And again, I think this depends on the type of region that you're looking at. But this was one of the reasons that we focused in Europe, because it was the region with the most amount of data available.
All right, so Christopher, tell us a little bit more about the states you covered in Europe.
About what?
The states you covered in Europe and and the implications of state history. So give some examples.
So we cover mainly western part of Europe. The extent of the geographic coverage that we have is based on the set of maps that are available through a company called Eurocentrism. So Eurocentrism provides about 21 layers of maps from each century from 080 to 2000. And based on this coverage, what we find is that places like Denmark and France, for example, would have very little turnovers. Places like Romania, for example, would have a lot of turnovers. So on the outset, when you're disaggregating the unit of analysis into square grid cells, what we find is empirically, there is this very robust and strong relationship between how many turnovers each region experiences and how many some of the other regions that did not experience as many turnovers. And again, what we find is that the more turnovers that you have, better it gets, but there comes a certain point where there are too many turnovers, and as a result, the economy suffers.
So for example, you mentioned Romania.
Yes.
Yeah, you said Romania, the number of turnovers.
Lots of turnovers. I believe they had about 15 or 16 turnovers in our papers. So that's a lot, because that would mean that on average, you'd have at least one turnover per century.
All right, so Christopher, name some of the better economic performers today based on their state history.
Better performance today.
Yeah, based on their state history.
Yeah, so mainly the kind of spread of economic divergence that we find in our paper does not differ too much from what you would see in other papers. That is, regions in Northwest Europe generally tend to have higher income levels. But what is interesting here would be something like, within the region of Italy, for example, you'd have huge variations. And those variations can be explained by the types of turnovers that you had over the course of history. So at the country level, you see broadly similar patterns that you would expect from other literature. But what's interesting about this study is that you are able to observe at the grid cell level, at the local level, the types of turnovers that you can observe from overlapping set of maps.
All right, and you said that Denmark had fewer turnovers?
I believe so. I mean, it's been a while since
Yeah, it's a complicated paper with large data sets.
Right. So I should have prepared like a concrete set of examples for you. But off the top of my head, Denmark was one of the states. Oh, France also didn't have as many turnovers. So compare that to, Romania, I think it comes up to my mind because that was one of the examples that we found to have lots of turnovers in the paper.
And then in your paper, you refer to Germany quite a bit. What did you find for Germany?
Germany was empirically challenging. This case study does not necessarily negate our overall findings, but in the old times, Germany was split into many hundreds of different princely kingdoms. So in order to finding that kind of disaggregated unit in terms of the boundaries was quite challenging. And this is something that Eurocentrism, the creator of the maps, also mentions. Germany compared to France, you'd see lots of very little kingdoms that exist at certain points throughout history.
State history is a growing area of research in economics, and for Africa, the information is just booming. Whenever I interview an economist who's interested in this type of research, I usually ask him if he would do a study on Africa.
This is going to be a data challenge. So if there are a comparable set of maps that are already digitized to carry out the same kind of exercise that I did for this paper, I would gladly do it because, again, as I told you before, the main data limitation is such that we don't have that kind of comparable set of maps that are ready for us to make use of in other parts of the world. That's why we started with Europe. But what's nice about challenging this kind of set of findings for other contexts is that you can really test whether this kind of findings is generalizable to other parts of the world as well. So I have to acknowledge that this paper that we are discussing right now is limited in scope because its implications are confined to the European context. Just to give you an example, you can see that China, for example, would have comparable land size as European continent itself, but it had far fewer boundary changes over time, right? So the types of hypotheses that we're making, whether state turnovers are good or bad for economic performance in the long run, if you're looking at this from the Chinese context, will the same hypothesis carry through? We're not quite sure because we haven't done the empirical exercise yet. So in the African case, the same concern is valid, right? So if we have similar type of data that we can work with or a set of maps, the next step would be to digitize them and then trace them over time so that we can do the same exercise.
All right then, but based on what I've been reading, we do know that there seems to be a relationship between pre-colonial centralization and modern income in the developing world, and the studies have been replicated for Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
But if I understand, if I recall correctly, they would not have traced changes in boundaries over time. It would be a one period change, right? So
yes, these studies are not as extensive. These studies are not as extensive as your study. You compared several centuries. They tend to look at shorter periods.
Right, and that's kind of the limiting factor with a lot of these studies that look at pre-industrial or pre-colonial institutions, where you would have one capture shot in a particular period in history, presentation of maps or boundaries at certain period. But it's very rare to find a set of maps on the same region that change over the course of multiple centuries. And that's what we're trying to do with this paper, that you detect the changes in boundaries over 20th century period. And that kind of exercise is going to be very challenging unless you have that set of maps. If you have just one map and you compare it to contemporary period, that's much easier done, but we don't know what happened in between.
But if you were interested in studying Africa, I think it would be good to use Ethiopia as a starting point because of its history, the Asante Empire. I do believe that we should have more data on Ethiopia.
True. I think that would be a fascinating project to pursue. The first thing that I would consider is what the unit of analysis would be, right? Because if it's not going to be confined to just single country study, then as I've done in my paper, you probably want to split the unit of analysis into equal size grid cell and then see what kind of boundary changes within that grid cell will obtain over multiple centuries. But that is certainly something that you can explore within the context of Ethiopia too. I have not seen that paper or that kind of study.
A paper was not done on Ethiopia, but we have historical books on Ethiopia. So for example, Briller recently published a book, I believe it's titled Ethiopia in the Medieval Ages. And another unit of analysis would be to analyze the relationship between state and church historically and its implications for secularism today, because because Christianity did play a major role in Ethiopia.
Right, as it did for many other regions of the world. Yes.
But Ethiopia is special because it's an African country that had Christianity before many places in Europe, and furthermore, Muslims found it difficult to penetrate Ethiopia.
Right, and it's I believe it's one of the countries that had the longest, very historical kingdom in existence for a long time.
Yes, Ethiopia and Kanem Bornu also had a long kingdom, Kanem Bornu in Africa. But Ethiopia is special. I've always been fascinated by Ethiopia, but now more studies are being published. Interestingly, however, in the 70s, a French journal, I believe it's called Perse, P-E-R-S-E, Perse used to publish many studies on Ethiopia and Axum. They're quite old, but they're fairly good because not many researchers are augmenting the studies. So the data and information are still relevant.
This is like a treasure trove for those who are interested in economic history and long-term growth. So you're giving scholars a good place to start digging. And yeah, I think one of the major motivations for the various research that I do is really taking the literature that's been based on European context and bring it out of that region and try to test out the existing hypothesis under different geographic contexts. So in my case, I've mostly been focused on looking at the Asian context, but other regions of the world, such as Africa, Latin America, and so forth, those will be fertile ground for future research as well.
And Christopher, because you're producing groundbreaking research on colonialism from an Asian standpoint, maybe you're going to write the first book comparing different colonial empires. Such a book does not exist.
Yeah, I mean, book project would be fantastic. It's such a, it's a daunting challenge, but I'm looking forward to exploring ideas in different book projects for sure.
Yeah, so for example, you have done studies on the impact of you have done studies on the impact of Japanese colonization on Asian countries, but I have not seen book length studies comparing British colonialism to Ottoman colonialism to Japan's colonialism.
Right. I think relatively speaking, when you're looking at studies in colonialism or colonization in general, you see tons of works done on the European colonization. But part of the reason that I focused on Japanese colonization is because there is that dearth of literature on it and for the Western audience. And I think the nature of colonization by the Japanese Empire was so inherently different that gives us kind of valuable context to work with and again, test out different hypotheses that have been forwarded by scholars who are just focused on European colonization. So that's another kind of main area of my research agenda right now.
So for example, obviously, like me, you have read studies detailing the consequences of British colonialism. But so far, the consensus appears to be that, on average, British colonies were more democratic. Some dispute this claim, but we do know that the quality of education in British colonies was superior, and on average, were per capita incomes tend to be higher. But then again, this could be selection bias. The British may have colonized richer colonies to begin with. Secondly, there's a legacy of the common law and British institutions tilting toward the free market and not necessarily protectionism or mercantilism like the Spanish. But I would love to see a study done by someone your level of intelligence comparing the democratic legacy of Asian colonialism versus British colonialism.
You're giving me lots of good ideas.
Yeah, I'm giving you a lot of work to do. I'm giving you a lot of work to do.
I do. Yes. I think my research focus is increasingly kind of just going on to Asia. So initially I started with Europe, and then the geographic scope kind of extended towards the east. So for a number of papers that I worked on, we were looking at Eurasia overall. And then now I'm looking more at China and East Asia, Southeast Asia, and so forth. But all of these with the mind that keeping in kind of context with that, with the previous set of works, how do you look at different historical processes from different angles and taken out of the Eurocentric perspective? That's what I'm trying to do.
And I don't have a problem with what you're doing. Eurocentrism is just one outlook to explore the world. Some people are Afrocentric and others focus on Asia. Charging someone with Eurocentrism is not an insult. It is just another perspective.
That's true. I'm just trying to, I guess, test out the established claims in different geographic areas.
And we are unable to validate the Eurocentric perspective if we do not study other cultures.
Yes.
Yes, it's really foolish. If you're saying that Western culture is superior, then it is superior to what? What is the standard of comparison?
Right.
Yes,
And surprisingly, there's not a lot of comparison studies. So you're, again, comparison between the Japanese and the English, the British Empire, especially when it comes to kind of pre-colonial institutions or human capital accumulation. That's the kind of area that I'm interested in looking at too. And one of the papers that you said you're interested in was looking at the Japanese empire impact on Korea. And I have a set of papers that deal with that topic as well.
I know you have written many papers. So in our interview, I mentioned the impact of Japan and colonialism, but that paper was not cited in the email I sent. Maybe you're referring to the paper titled "Does Lineage Matter? A Study of Ancestral Influence on Educational Attainment in Korea."
So those are related. Shall we talk about that paper today?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the second paper today, but before we do so, another quick point. China.
Okay.
Social change in China is rarely revolutionary. So there is one paper published by a researcher of Chinese descent. I don't remember the person's name. And the individual was looking at social change in China across several centuries. And he concluded that usually elites co-opt social change. And I'm saying this to indicate that though China has benefited from free market reforms, based on what I have been reading, it is evident that the Chinese prefer stability to disruptive innovation. So even if GDP continues to increase, I doubt that China will overtake America as the economic superpower.
Because they are okay with the current regime in terms
No,
of
stability. The Chinese, based on what the researcher was saying, that historically the Chinese have preferred stability to disruptive social change. So even if they do not like the communism, Chinese identity is central to their outlook. In other words, China is different from the West, and they want to maintain that perception of what it means to be Chinese. And as such, they're unwilling to become as radical as the West because Western culture is disruptive and rebellious, and the Chinese prefer order in comparison to the revolutionary nature of Western society. So if you're looking at it from that angle, the Chinese people are smart and they know what they want. They're not saying capitalism is a problem and capitalism cannot be redefined based on Chinese terms. They are saying we appreciate Chinese culture. This is what we want. Even if we do not agree with all the policies of Xi Jinping, we know what we want and we don't want to be like the West.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. I don't know if it's coming from, say, the Chinese liking stability per se, but that could be part of their political culture, right? So if you think about how the Western hegemony in the past century has dominated the world, there's a strong alliance between the UK and the US, for example. And I think that's part of it is because they are culturally aligned. So there's a lot of cultural affinity around this Western bloc that consists of US and the UK. And a lot of the supporters or partners around this bloc have been extremely powerful. Now, I think economically, China has come up as a rising power and has become a superpower. But to have that kind of projection of political power that competes against the Western bloc, I think China is having a lot of struggle because it's a bit of an island. So I think as a culture, China is very different from the Western hegemony that we're used to seeing. And part of it might be that they like stability more so than disruptive political institutions. But that's just one of the many factors that makes China very unique. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question or we're just discussing.
We're just having a discussion. We're just having a free flowing discussion.
For me, it's always a bit of an enigma. But China is such a big field and study that I think the kind of argument that you proposed here, it makes a lot of sense. But I don't think I read that paper before. But
yeah, I can always send you the email. It was published by MPRA, the Munich Research Center. They put out a lot of good papers.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, but China is just really interesting. I sometimes Japan is viewed as a better case study because the Japanese after the Meiji Restoration became like the West, but they still retained Japanese culture. So Japan is a great case study. Yes, economically you may become like the West, but socially and politically you're still Japan.
Another very unique case study. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
the Meiji Restoration, they adopted the Western legal system, Western attire, but they're still Japanese.
they're yeah. Have you been to Japan before?
No, I've
They're
never been to Japan. Have you?
yeah. I have been there. I spent a summer there visiting a local university 2 years ago. It was fascinating.
And
Yeah.
where are you from, Christopher? South Korea?
Yeah, I'm Korean descent.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so were you born in the States?
Uh, Canada.
Oh, in Canada. Oh, okay, I don't know where I assumed that you were an American. But Christopher, South
Yes.
Korea is also unappreciated. I think so. South Korea has immense history to be studied.
Mhm. Yeah, it's again this is a country with just incredibly rich history, and you know, for scholars like us, it's a great
You're
case
the
study.
scholar. I'm a YouTuber.
For interested audience, I suppose. For people like us who are interested in research, I think Korea presents itself as very much underexploited case study, just waiting to be explored. Because the more that I dig into this country, the more valuable historical data that are available, and oftentimes they are digitized too. So if you have the language skills and if you know where to look, it's a great place to uncover many different phenomena that happened. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm taking my first dibs at some of these topics that before others kind of, scoop them away.
Yeah, you're a pioneer. So now we can talk about your paper on South Korea and education. And this is my question. What explains the endurance of elite families in South Korea?
So, right. I think a lot of people are aware that there's traditionally been very heavy emphasis on education in Korea. And this was the motivating kind of driving question that I was wondering about, where is this fervor for education coming from in that country? And I traced it back to Joseon Dynasty, which was existing dynasty, a kingdom before the Korea was colonized by Japan. During this time period, there was a civil service examination, which was a meritocratic practice to select bureaucrats for those who passed the exams. So what happened was, of the elite families, their status would have been dependent on their descendants passing these exams. And as such, you had very heavy emphasis on people studying classic Chinese, the Confucian studies, for example. And this was very onerous task. You'd have candidates studying for decades before passing the exam. So I think there is this mix of Confucian culture where a scholar is supposed to be the top of the social ladder, and centuries of civil service exam that really expounded the virtue of study. And I think that kind of persisted throughout centuries. And then what I find in the paper is that indeed there's a strong correlation in regions that traditionally saw lots of exam passers and higher education attainment today. So this is very much like a long-term historical study. I don't have like a clear causal mechanism to explain why there's this strong correlation. But when you test this empirically, you do find this very interesting association. So that's what the paper is about.
Your paper is quite compelling. And I've been asking myself, okay, what are these families transmitting? Is it culture, genes, outlook, or the trio? Because it is quite obvious that their legacies endure across several centuries.
Right. So I would expect there's a combination of many things. You have what James Kang, one of my good friends, who also does studies on
Repeat
this.
that person's name. What is the person's name?
James Kang. So he's a
Oh, oh,
professor
oh,
from
oh,
Kang
James
University.
who?
Kang, Kung.
Oh, Kung. Okay.
Yes, James Kang. So he's a scholar he was looking at the Chinese version of the civil service examination during Qing Dynasty, and what he terms as the family cultural capital. You see transmission, intergenerational transmission of know-hows in state craftsmanship or how to pass the exam, how to study diligently, and all these other things that passes down generations and more so than others, emphasis on education. I think that's tremendously important. So these virtues and values, probably like the norms, the family norms that pass down generation, that is one possible plausible mechanism that could explain why civil service exam, which ended around late 1800s, somehow has implications on how well people, how much emphasis there's on education today. So again, it's a bit of just as with any other kind of long-term studies, it's very challenging to refute or kind of defend this kind of argument because you have many other intervening factors that could explain the variation in higher education enrollment rates. But empirically, when you're controlling for some of these factors, you still have a pretty robust relationship. So I think it certainly makes sense. But of course, this kind of work always comes under heavy criticism too.
Why?
So
Why would people criticize it? Well, obviously for methodological reasons, but what are the intellectual positions for critiquing a paper of this nature?
I think economic historians, when looking at the Korean context, you have many different pivotal historical moments that could have completely disrupted society. So you have, of course, decades of Japanese colonization, which was followed by the Korean War, right? And then you had a period of dictatorship, rapid economic growth. And by the end of Joseon Dynasty, this elite system was abandoned. So when Yangban was the term reserved for the nobility class, but there was no more Yangban system. So you would have many kind of disruptions that happen throughout history. And it's very difficult to control for all these events. But what's also interesting is that despite these set of events that could have completely disrupted the order of society, you still have this strong correlation. So I think that's where the findings that I have in this paper speaks volumes about maybe it is true. Maybe there's some grain of truth to this. Just as anecdotal evidence, if you ask someone from Korea, and if you have an illustrative family history, then you would say, oh, my great grandparents were, scholars of high standing or something. So this is a point of very much family pride. So scholarship in the Confucian sense, traditionally in Korea, is something that was very much valued upon.
A parallel to Korea is the Asante Empire, now Ghana. Asante Empire was the imperial power on the Gold Coast. It conquered the other territories. Kumasi was the capital, but today we just say Ghana. God in the Asante Empire, elites often engage in relationships with other elites. And today we refer to assortative mating, indicating that educated men are marrying educated women. But Neil Cummins and Gregory Clark argue that in the past, educated men were also selecting for social traits that indicated intelligence in women. So I think this is another interesting angle. Maybe earlier, Korean men were also marrying highly educated women who did not have these qualifications on paper.
That is plausible. Yeah, I find that to be plausible.
So I'm giving you another homework. You can go and study the Asante Empire.
Sure. This pairing of African and Asian context was something that I did not envision for myself, but thanks for giving me those ideas. Appreciate it.
Yes, it's going to make you a superstar. Yes, the Asante Empire is really interesting because the Asante had a strict marriage system. They really liked it when these, well, noble was not a term they used, but they preferred upper class people to marry to other upper class people.
I see.
Yes, Africa is quite phenomenal. There are
Mm.
many issues to be studied and unlocked.
I think so, especially from historical perspectives. So if you are looking at studies on colonization, uh, maybe years ago, people were interested in the impact of colonization on current contemporary economic or social political outcomes. But then I think scholars have started digging farther into history. So the subject of interest is more about what existed before colonization took over. What were some of the pre-colonial institutions that contributed to the outcomes that we see today? In that context, I've seen some papers on Africa, but it's definitely a very much underexploited region. And most of the studies on Africa, I think, are focused on development outcomes today. So the contemporary context, there's a lot coming out, but I think historical perspectives, there's very much, there's a lot to be done.
Exactly my point. But you also did a paper on Japan and South Korea. It was exploring the impacts of Japanese rule on South Korea and education.
Mm.
It's titled
Right.
Colonization and Education, Exploring the Legacy of Local Elites in Korea.
Yes. So that's it's kind of a continuation of the other paper that we talked about. It uses the same set of data. So the motivation for that paper again is that the predominant the opinion among Korean economic history scholars is that Japanese colonization brought about modernization and industrialization of Korea. But what I wanted to explore is how human capital accumulation already occurred. Like there's a high human capital through this civil service examination. So there are lots of talented, educated people, population in Korea before colonization took over. So the outcome variable for that paper is literacy rate. And what we find is that the areas that traditionally had a lot of exam passers continue to have higher literacy rate in that area under the Japanese colonization. So it wasn't necessarily because there was this public school education system that was implemented by the Japanese Empire. It also had to do with what kind of pre-existing human capital there existed in Korea before Japan came to invade and colonize.
But how would you judge the impact of colonization on South Korea?
Um, there are certainly indicators that a lot of the infrastructure, public infrastructure like railroads, elementary schools, and so forth would have been, they were built during the colonial period. And this is the main kind of argument for scholars to say when Japan colonized, that's when Korea became developed during that time period. But of course, there is opposing side of this argument too, which is that we don't know what the counterfactual is. But had Japan not invaded Korea and colonized, would Korea have been able to develop by itself, right? And one of the things that I'm looking at here is that during Joseon Dynasty, there was already high level of human capital accumulation. So it could be that even without the colonization, that country might have prospered. But we don't know because historically what happened was it was colonized.
Christopher,
Yeah.
what you just uttered an opinion that's really controversial, and let me tell you why. On average, British colonialism was more positive than negative. Colonial powers engage in illicit activities, but for the most part, their institutions, schools, etc., resulted in an increase in human capital. Now, I'm specifically referring to European colonial powers. But despite this fact, well, not we, but some often argue that colonialism was negative for the developing world. But when the shoe is on the other foot and we're talking about a non-white colonial power, apparently it becomes positive. Even though, as you said, South Korea already had relatively high levels of human capital, whereas Africa and the Caribbean did not.
So again, we're talking about counterfactual here.
Yeah,
So
yes.
we'll be able to get the truth out of this. But what I'm saying is that when you have a society that had already high human capital, and it was under the threat of colonialization, if there were enough time spent for the country to adapt and modernize and internally reform itself, I think Korea might have been just fine. But
I
because it
agree.
didn't have, yeah, and it just didn't have enough time to become modern. It was taken over. It was all colonized by Japan. So I'm gonna digress a bit here and talk about another set of papers that is related to this topic, because I have a set of papers on Thailand. So Thailand is often considered a comparative case to Japan because formerly it was never colonized. So it was the only state in Southeast Asia never to be colonized. Because it successfully carried out political reform internally, right? It was facing threat of Western colonization, and then under this threat, it was enough for the country or the kingdom, Siam, it was called back then. So Siam to reform itself and adopt modernized infrastructure such as railroads, schools, and so forth as well. So if I could imagine the same case for Korea, it was facing the threat of Western colonization from Britain, France, and Russia, Japan. If it had enough time to reform itself, it would have walked a very different trajectory in history, I imagine, but it didn't.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Christopher. But the counterfactuals are no longer counterfactual because we are being fed new data on a daily and yearly basis. We do know that in the developing world, excluding Asian countries, that the Americas and Africa were lagging behind. Maybe they would have developed in without colonialism, but their development would have occurred over a longer trajectory. But we must admit that Asians were relatively more successful. Therefore, their development needed a shorter duration. Yet the silly and atrocious argument is that, okay, let me not be polemical, but some may indicate or contend, as you say, that without colonization, South Korea would not have developed. But when analyzing European colonial powers, their assertions are often negative. Yet, these assumptions are not complemented by data.
So
That's my point. That's my point. I'm not defending colonialism. I'm just saying,
no.
You get the
I
point.
get your point. Yeah, I think it's a valid point. So I think the takeaway here for me is that you really need to figure out what kind of infrastructure, what kind of institutions, what kind of development indicators, human capital in particular, existed prior to colonization process. So I don't think you can compare Korea's human capital accumulation level compared to Africa or Latin America.
Exactly.
For that matter. It doesn't compare because this is a country with 1,000 years of history. It had long
and writing. Please note that it had writing. So in the Americas, they were technological sophisticated, but they didn't write.
So you have a long-standing dynasty with pretty sophisticated technology in its own right, and a writing system, again, civil service exam. So all these things indicate that it was a very much developed state in itself. And then it was colonized. So if you don't take into consideration, again, what kind of institution existed prior to colonization, then you don't have the full story here. So I think that's all. Yeah, that's the takeaway.
Exactly. So now, Christopher, I'm going to give you more homework. You're going to do a study comparing the pre-colonial trajectory of Africa or Latin America to Asian countries, and then make a conclusion.
Yeah, that's yet another avenue for research. So
It's going to make you famous and infamous.
you have already indicated several chapters for this non-existent book, but I'm interested in pursuing those topics for sure.
All right, and now we're going to talk about a piece you wrote on ethnic tensions and external kin. It's titled External Kin, Economic Develop, External Kin, Economic Diversity and Minority Ethnic Group Mobilization. Economic disparity, sorry.
It's a bit wordy. The title that now I'm looking at it, it's a bit wordy. So this, I mean, it's been a while. It was published in 2014. Let me tell you how we got started with this project. There are many different kind of explanations or mechanisms that could explain minority grievance against central state. And the literature kind of points to, I suppose, two main things. One is economic disparity and say ethnic discrimination. So these are some of the things that lead minority groups in a country to form grievance and in sometimes manifest itself into civil violence against central state. So in that literature, we're kind of wondering, well, you know, if you are, is there any other kind of theory or mechanism that we haven't explored yet? So we thought about external kin, right? So if you are, I don't know, Jamaican.
I'm Jamaican, yes.
Yeah. So if you're living overseas outside of Jamaica, maybe your point of reference for economic disparity is not with other people living in the same countries that you do, but maybe you're thinking about how relatively better off your external kin is, right? So this kind of point of comparison can be different, right? So your point of reference is not with the people you're living with inside your own country or state, but your external kin that's outside the country. So we test that out, and turns out that if you have a lot of disparity between your living standards or economic standing against your external kin living elsewhere, then you become more aggrieved, and yeah, you become frustrated.
And you gave the example of ethnic minorities in China. I know they compare themselves to their counterparts in Turkey and other countries.
Right. So Koreans, for example, you have Korean Chinese living in China. So their point of reference in terms of how well off are we may not be against other minority ethnic groups in China, but against Koreans living in Korea, right? So if they say, well, we're so much worse off than the Koreans living in Korea, then you might say, okay, I'm not very happy with the way that I live my life in China right now. So that's the story that we're telling. So in order to carry out this kind of analysis, what you do is you match the geocoded location of different ethnic minority groups. We use data set called MAR, minorities at risk. And then you place the location of these minority groups on the map. And then you correlate that with set of outcomes that proxy for grievance across different regions in the world.
And your study is quite breathtaking. Not many people are doing research from this angle.
So there are
external kin. I'm specifically referring to external kin. So in that sense, it's a bit innovative.
Yeah. So this idea really came from my co-author Enze Han. He's at Hong Kong University right now. And when I first heard about this idea, I thought it was fascinating. And the previous title for this paper was not this wordy title that seems, kind of hard to spell out. But I believe the first title that we came up with was something like "Keeping Up with the Joneses." So you're comparing yourself against others, but that comparison group does not have to come from the same country that you're living in it. It may be kinship based. And this idea seemed quite fresh, so we carried out the analysis. But major caveat here that I think we also discussed in the paper is that, first of all, it's a kind of cross-country, single period study. So we are not able to kind of detect any kind of seasonal or temporal changes in these kind of attitudes or shifts. So if you have a lot of mobility, like migration or movement across different minority groups, that's also not captured in this analysis. So I think it's definitely a paper that gives food for thought, but I wouldn't necessarily call this the best kind of empirically robust set of findings that I've
Well,
obtained.
you are the first mover, and your followers will benefit from second mover advantage. So
Hopefully, and
in that context, it is an amazing paper. So Christopher, I
yes,
love our conversation, and okay, I'm not a big talker, but if I'm having an intellectual conversation, I can speak for hours and hours. However, these days I have decided that I want to create shorter videos. So we have been talking for around 50 minutes.
okay.
Originally, I wanted to talk for 40 minutes, but the 50 minutes were worth it. So unfortunately, I have to say bye. Do people like shorter videos? I think so.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. It was a pleasure talking to you, Lipton.
Yeah,
And
maybe you're my favorite guest.
oh, thank you very much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
and I have many great guests, but this conversation was just very relaxing and it flowed quite easily.
it. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and thanks for taking interest in my work. I was very happy to hear from you, and hopefully, the upcoming papers that I eventually get to publish, you'll enjoy them too.
All right, but last question: do people like shorter videos?
Take care.
Yes, they care.
Oh, yeah, I said take care. I thought we were cutting it short.
Yeah, yeah, okay, okay. So you're very smart. Okay, all right then. Okay, bye.
Bye.